Welcome to the April Forum of Calumet Revisited. I am Michael Bowes of the Association for the Wolf Lake Initiative. Valerie Penninan, Professor Emerita of History at Calumet College of St. Joseph, is co-sponsor. Before we start tonight's speaker, are there any announcements? If not, tonight's speaker is Joseph Costas. Is that how you pronounce it?
It's Coates.
Coates. Okay.
Uh-huh.
I'm glad I asked. Um, he's an archivist at Purdue University Northwest. Joe, would you like to begin?
Sure. All right, everyone. So thank you for coming. I thought about initially doing a big PowerPoint and making it all fancy, but I thought it would be nice maybe if I just gave a little discussion here, then we can talk about, the future of the mills and everything around Northwest Indiana and a little bit about this project that we're undertaking and kind of where that goes. So just to give you a little bit of a history of myself, both me and my wife are natives of Hammond. My dad he started at Youngstown Sheet and Tube. My grandfather had worked at Youngstown Sheet and Tube. My other grandfather worked at Sinclair Oil. So pretty much everybody in my family at one time or another worked for either a refinery or a steel mill. I was the one that bucked the system, not by any luck other than bad luck. I joined the military because I was not very good at school, and somehow 30 years later, I end up kind of doing archive work at a university. So sometimes things change, but this has been a really fun experience for me to kind of be able to integrate what I do for a living into the mills and into Northwest Indiana and sort of the Calumet region as a whole. Um, a friend of mine once said when I was in the reserves with him, he was from South Holland, and he talked about Northwest Indiana. He said it was the Quebecois of Indiana, that we were too much like Chicago for Indiana to want us, and too much like Indiana for Chicago to want us. So we were sort of uh, the black sheep of the state, if you will. And a lot of that does have to come with the fact that living in a backfilled swamp, we by a big lake and riverways, we weren't very good at doing with farming as much, but we could sure uh, have some heavy industry and stuff. So most of the Calumet region and sort of the area that we're talking about is the bi-state area across Northwest Indiana and South Chicago. It's historically shaped by industry, labor migration, and environmental change. And we're going to talk about not just the industry, but some of the environmental change, not just from Acme and the mills, but other, and sort of how that affects the region. Our key industries were steel, oil, refining, and shipping, kind of defined by the Grand Calumet and Little Calumet rivers, and as part of the Great Lakes Basin. And the Kankakee Marsh delayed early settlement. When I was a student at IU Northwest and I took the Indiana history class, not knowing much about Indiana history, I was surprised that this part of the state developed so late. But sitting in a swamp, it wasn't, or a marsh, wasn't really ideal for farming and homesteading. So that was something I learned a little bit later on in life. So with steelmaking in the region here, we attracted diverse immigrant groups, Polish, Italian, and then later African American and Mexican workers. And then our labor unions were strengthened by advocating for rights and better working conditions. Part of that has to do with, World War I and the unionization of U.S. Steel in order to maybe to produce for the war. Some people might look at that as war profiteering, but it is what it is. This is what sort of built the area. We were the ideal spot for it. So the growth of the steel industry early on started with companies, Mark Manufacturing, that of course built Markstown there, that still exists, Youngstown Sheet and Tube, Inland Steel, and then a few smaller places like LaSalle Steel, Bethlehem Steel, Acme Steel. There were a lot of these mills and industries in the area at the time, and sort of they've been either closed or gobbled up by other industries over time. So at one time, the Calumet region was the largest steel producing area in the United States. So we had, we kind of cornered the market on that, which was also surprising to me. I thought it would have been the Pittsburgh area, but we really were sort of the area that became the largest steel producing area. And some of that has to do with geography. We're fairly flat and we have a huge lake. You ever go to Pittsburgh, driving up and down all the hills and things there, you're kind of surprised that it's as hilly as it is, and you think, oh, it's a little bit harder to move goods and services around. So neighborhood identities formed around the steel mills, like the South Deering neighborhood for Acme, East Chicago Harbor with Marktown, the Hammond, East Chicago, Indiana Harbor area. All of these areas were sort of defined by the mill that was located in the area. Gary is named after Gary Eldridge of U.S. Steel. So to say that that it defined our area, it gave some of our cities and towns and neighborhoods their actual name of the steel. So a little bit, a quick history, just a quick snippet before we move on, though. Acme there was a evolution. So Acme started out making parts. They started out making hinges. From what I can find in the archive so far, the owner of Byproduct was irritated every time that they would get some sort of shipping in. Things were broken. So they started making hinges and clasps and things that would sort of help secure up all those goods. So they were making chains and hinges and hooks and all these other banding material, things like that, before they became a coke plant. So in 1905, they merged with Interlake Iron in 1964, and that formed Interlake Steel, which was the 11th largest steel producer in the area. So we know it operated over in South Deering, and the area that we're talking about was a coke plant. It really just produced coke, which is used in steel production. And as a kid, I remember it was coke dust and reciprocator dust would basically cover everything in the neighborhood. And I know a lot of places like my high school and the church I grew up at would do big car washes in the spring, and that was usually when the mill workers showed up, and they would make you earn that $10 by getting rid of all that. And I can't imagine how much of that stuff now, thinking back, went down into the sewers and away it goes, So just looking at a little bit of the history, and I made sure that I wrote this down because it's a little bit, there were a lot of name changes and there were a lot of sort of location changes where it moved around. But the Acme Coke plant on Chicago's southeast side goes back to 1905 when it was incorporated as the Byproducts Coke Corporation. It was built along South Torrance Avenue to take advantage of rail access and the proximity to the Calumet River. By the 1910s, it became a key part of tightly integrated iron and steel making that included that sort of it fed the nearby blast furnaces and steel mills. In 1929, the company was renamed.
Oh,
I have to tell you, being sort of childish, I always think back to those Looney Tunes cartoons when I still to this day when I think about Acme Steel. So for nearly a century, the coke plant operated as a foundational component of Chicago's Calumet Region steel economy, supporting generations of industrial workers and the surrounding neighborhoods. So the plant specialized in the production of coke, which is carbon-rich fuel made by heating coal in large airtight ovens. That was another thing that confused me, coming from a steelworker family, but not really ever working at a steel mill. I was a little bit confused by when they kept talking about the batteries, coke batteries, and I thought, batteries? I came from a Navy background, so a lot of things are powered by, submarines have huge battery banks and things, and you're like, what is this? But those airtight ovens were known as the batteries. So these airtight ovens would create coke through a process known as destructive distillation. At its peak, the facility operated multiple batteries of coke ovens and advanced byproduct recovery systems. So they would capture coal tar, ammonia, and light oils that were usually sold rather than wasted. The coke produced at the Torrance Avenue fueled nearby blast furnaces operated by Interlake and later Acme, making the plant an indispensable upstream supplier in regional steelmaking. Railroads and internal conveyor systems connected the coke works to the furnace across the Calumet River, indicating the high degree of vertical integration that characterized heavy industry on Chicago's South Side. One of the things that I'm disappointed to have never really paid attention to, apparently there was a bridge that went across Torrance Avenue there also that would carry everything over. And when I was a youth, we would go to, there's a restaurant on Torrance Avenue called Dom Pedro's right before the bridge to go into Hegwish. And we would go there and hang out. I never got a chance to see those bridges, so that was a little disappointing for me. So, this coke plant operated for quite a long time. So beginning like in the 90s, Acme, they faced mounting pressures from declining domestic steel demand, aging infrastructure, and stricter environmental regulations affecting coke production nationwide. After the bankruptcy of Acme Steel, coke operations at the plant ceased in November of 2021, and the site was abandoned. What remained was a heavily contaminated industrial landscape marked by hydrocarbon, cyanide, and heavy metals. Emergency cleanup actions occurred in the mid-2000s, but comprehensive remediation lagged for years. So just a few years ago, 2024, the EPA added the former coke site to the Superfund National Priorities List, formally recognizing the site's long-term environmentally damage and sort of closing the chapter on one of those large industrial facilities. So one of the problems with having the steel industry in this area isn't just the fact that they are polluters, right? We know that over time they've gotten cleaner and cleaner, and I am not going to sit here and tell people to shut these things down. I'm much more apt to try to find better ways to make cleaner steel and have cleaner industry, because I understand I like air conditioning. I like having a car. You need metal. You need steel to make things. You need some chemicals to live a modern lifestyle. But from back, when we didn't worry about these things as much, they've left long-term effects in these Superfund sites because of the fact that this area is kind of a big backfilled marshland. This is much harder to clean up because a lot of this soaks into the ground and causes issues. So when I was kind of looking around at Superfund sites in the area, one of the things that I started thinking about was sort of not just the environmental impact, but sort of the social impact and sort of how it affects the citizens of the area. My wife and I were sitting and talking last night about how her and I both grew up in the Hessville area of Hammond. And we knew I lived in the older section, she lived in the newer section. So we were joking about who lived in the nicer part, who lived in the old part. But the reality is, most of those homes in the Hessville region were somewhere between 800 to 1,500 square feet, 2 to 3 bedrooms, a bath and a half. If you were lucky, you got an extra. If you had a second bathroom when I was a kid, I would have thought that you were a doctor or something by having 2 bathrooms in your home. So this isn't really affecting people of a lot of money. This isn't help. These areas aren't hurting people with a lot of money, right? It's affecting normal middle class working people throughout the community. So the Calumet region contains multiple EPA Superfund sites, and we have a legacy of industrial waste, lead contamination, and groundwater pollution. So this has impacts on our communities, housing, and public health, right? So we're going to end up, because of these sites, having higher incidence of cancer and other issues health-wise. So, to kind of go on from the environmental impact, when I was doing a little bit of digging here, the numbers are really, really hard to track down because a lot of these leaking areas aren't Superfund sites, and some of them are on private property, and they're a little bit harder to find. But when the coking plant closed in 2001, it left behind about 100 acres of contaminated industrial land. So these, as we know, were former wetlands that were turned into severely polluted zones. And the Calumet region, from the numbers I was able to find, have almost 1,400 leaking underground storage sites and about 3,800 toxic sites requiring remediation. Now, that's not all steel mill or oil refinery. A lot of those areas are like abandoned gas stations around in the region. Somebody builds a new gas station, the old one sits and the tanks rot and whatever. So some of this is normal urban, sort of urban blight. Some of it are the leaking tanks and other things around the Calumet region. So just something to think about. The example that I used at the last presentation I did was the USS Lead Superfund site in East Chicago. So this is a massive area in East Chicago that contains lead and arsenic contamination that affects residential neighborhoods. So this isn't some, empty site where a mill once sat or something once, an old factory or something like that. This is an area where people live. People's homes are here, right? One of the ways that we build wealth in the United States is by buying a home. So these people that lived by the mill or the refinery and work there are now living on a Superfund site. So that has a big financial impact on the community. So when people talk about things like environmental justice, this is what we're talking about. So this this affects has a disproportionate impact on marginalized communities. So sometimes, companies aren't as transparent, and this also causes activism efforts to pop up in these communities to speak out and hopefully puts the feet to the fire of some of these corporations. The fact is, we don't want to, we want to sort of democratize. We don't want to just make profit. You don't let industry off the hook for polluting and stuff. We want them to be held accountable for things like that. So this environmental justice has a disproportionate impact on low income and minority communities. Some of these communities don't know until, decades down the line that they're living on a Superfund site. So, there's growing advocacy movements and legal actions that are taking place. Later on, when we talk a little bit about the actual project and the archives themselves, we're going to talk, it's going to kind of go back to environmental justice. So I guess it's time to kind of talk a little bit about the project itself and where it all came from. So this came through the Calumet Heritage Partnership. For those of you who don't know, it's the bi-state group preserving the Calumet Region's heritage. It was founded around 1999, and its mission is to enrich lives through stewardship and interpretation. So that interpretation we're going to get back to when we talk a little bit about the project. So some of these efforts have led to efforts to create the Calumet Heritage Area, and we have, partners through the Calumet Collaborative, the Field Museum. There's now an exhibit at Museum of Science and Industry. Purdue University Northwest now is happy to be a partner in with this partnership. So some of the themes are nature reworked, innovation and change, and then crucible of culture, so ethnic and working class heritage. So although a lot of these things are changing over time, we want to make sure that we're preserving that history through the era, about the area. So one of the things that I received, and I'll talk a little bit about the collection here in a minute, but I just kind of wanted to focus on what happened when we received this collection. It came in on pallets, and everything was covered in coke dust, and gravel was under the pallets, and we had heavy equipment. We had boxes of paperwork mixed in with hard hats and metacarpal boots, and it was a little bit of a mess, but it was preserved. One of the things that I really noticed when we were going through this was that there wasn't a lot of actual personal history or like narratives. There was a lot of photographs of equipment. There were schematic drawings. There were EPA reports. There were union contracts. There were things like that. But there wasn't a lot of those narratives that sometimes you find in other larger collections. We don't even have we don't have a lot of flyers or anything like that. Some places will put out like a company newspaper or a newsletter or something like that. We don't have many of those. So one of the things that I started looking at when we were looking at this collection is how do we include steelworker narratives in this? So kind of talking about the mill culture, dangers that took place in the mill, solidarity amongst workers, change of technology and workforce demographics, the effects of downsizing in the late 20th century, which every time I say late 20th century, it makes me kind of sad. It doesn't feel like we should be in like late 20th century shouldn't be a thing, but I guess it is. I went to high school in the late 20th century. That wasn't that long ago. And so we want to humanize that environment. We want to make sure that people understand that this isn't a big corporation that just polluted a lot, and how dare you, do some finger wagging at these companies for pollution. People worked there. People raised their families. People, they lived and worked and created, there were people there. So people opened barber shops and hardware stores and all these things to sort of keep these communities going. So we were missing out on some of the people part of it. So the collection that we have, I think it ended up being 32 pallets total. And I broke them down, and eventually we got down to where we have, I think, 10 pallets in the back. And I actually know what's in most of them. And then we ended up with archive collection wise, we ended up with around, I don't remember exactly how many boxes we have, but the finding aid for this collection is about 123 pages long. So if any of you have ever used an archive before, every archival collection has a finding aid. So if you think of the collection as just a book, think of this as sort of a mix between the table of contents, the index, and a brief narrative of the book, right? So each box has sort of a theme to it, whether it's a part of, a lab or something like that. And then all the documentations has a file that's labeled in each one that sort of describes what's in that box, what's in that collection. And they're findable. I think we have somewhere around 200 boxes, and they're 1 foot by 1 foot, or 1 foot. Yeah, they're 1 foot boxes. Think of like, if you go and you buy a box of like copier paper, what those come in, like a small moving box, those are the size of those archival boxes. So these materials were salvaged, and they came to the Hammond campus of Purdue Northwest. They came to me at the time. I was the university archivist, and this was sort of a partnership between the Calumet Heritage Partnership and Purdue Northwest. So included in this were scale models, manuals, blueprints, helmets, workwear. We had about 22,000 aperture cards, which are similar to a negative on film. So we had a lot of things like procedural documents, HR complaints. Those were fun to read. People complaining about their coworkers, that kind of thing. So we got a little bit of the human element to it, but there was a lot of, it was really just negative stuff, and we kind of wanted to hear more positive things. So once we got that collection sort of handled, we didn't do we didn't do really in depth. If you can do really in depth, you're going document by document and you're indexing everything on there. So ours is more of a theme. So each box has about 20 files in it, and it will tell you what's in each of those files. And a lot of it's organized chronologically or by subject. So let's say something like sulfur readings, box 2, folder 1, sulfur readings 1957 to 1959, something like that. So we could read all these things and we can look at all these things, but we wanted to know, or we still want to know, how does this affect the people that worked there, and how did it affect their lives? How did it affect their environment? What are their thoughts on it? So we started looking at doing things like oral history. So oral history as a method is used to preserve lived experience of people. So in this case, industrial steelworkers. So it provides a context beyond the official records, right? One of the first things that I did when I became the archivist at Purdue Northwest, it was still Purdue Calumet when I started. And they said, we want you to digitize something. And I thought, oh, great, nothing like, clear directions, digitize something. So the first thing I chose to digitize were the student newspapers, because the student newspaper was controlled by the students. So the administration couldn't really, um, they didn't have as much influence over what was being digitized. So we could kind of tell the history of the university from the students' viewpoint first. We've since added course catalogs and things like that, but I kind of really wanted more of the sort of the history of the students, or the history of the university through the students. So a lot of times what this does is it highlights community identity and the resilience of community and the things that people did and the things that they lived. Just a quick little narrative from my end. I had a birthday a couple weeks ago, and I decided it'd be a good day to go interview my dad, because I took some time off, a couple days off. Went and talked to my parents. I asked my dad if I could record him. He said sure. Now, my dad worked at well, it started out as Youngstown, so he worked in the East Chicago Works. He was a mechanic at the mill. He worked there for 50 years. He retired right when Cleveland Cliffs bought them. He joked that he quit because he didn't want to have to change hard hats again. The reality was that he was 68 years old and needed a new knee. So that kind of ended his career. And rightfully so. We were trying to get him to retire 2-3 years before that. But he talked about when he started at the mill in the 70s, and just the way that safety works, and that the way that jobs were sort of handed out. And he talked about being an apprentice, a mechanic's apprentice at the mill. And he said some of the people you really liked working with, some of the people were just jerks, and then some of them were kind of, he said, terrifying to be around. And I thought, terrifying, this was early 70s, so my dad worked with quite a few men who had moved to the U.S. after World War II, and quite a few of them were of European descent and had spent many, many years in POW camps controlled by Nazi Germany at the time. So he talked about how some of these guys were really very damaged from their time working there. So some of those things that you really don't think about until somebody talks about it, how things that happened back then. Like, I'm pretty sure if at my next staff meeting, if I threw a 15-pound sledgehammer at somebody on my staff, I would be fired. This guy, he was able to get away with that. They had one of the guys that they worked with who had type 1 diabetes, and I guess at the time you couldn't work at the mill. So he said, "Oh yeah, when it was his turn for urinalysis, somebody just peed in the cup for him, and they called it good. Like, they just didn't care." Things like that don't happen anymore, but we want to make sure that things like that are recorded for the future, so people do know that that's what the culture was. So, the Calumet Heritage Partnership helped to save this this collection. It sat in Pullman for a while, and then we received it in 2022. Actually, yeah. So in 2024, the initial finding aid was complete. Part of this was done through a grant from the Donnelly Foundation. And I went through and I figured out the time. So it was myself and 2 student workers. I had 1 graduate student and I had 1 undergraduate student. The undergraduate student, full disclosure, was my daughter, because I wasn't going to have her sitting around all summer because she couldn't find a job. So guess what? She got to go to work with me, and I got to take her home and made sure that she actually did her job. Somebody was like, "Oh, would it be nice to work for your dad for the summer?" And she said, "Absolutely not. He actually made me do stuff." So we had over 1,000 hours in this collection between the 3 of us, putting this together. So the initial finding aid was completed in June of 2024. So to me, the purpose of this collection overall is to honor the steelworkers in the region's industrial past, preserves cultural memory and lived experiences. And the big goal is to have it support research into environmental, social, and economic impacts of now deindustrialization. For the future, we're looking at doing oral history, but a lot of people, I'm torn on that term myself. I much prefer the community memory a little bit better. So doing focus group and interviews add a human experience to the archive. So we want to talk about things like daily routines, dangers of the mill, workplace culture, social bonds, effects of home life, mental and physical stress. People will donate things or talk about certain items that have a deep emotional connection to them. And then show how families preserved industrial history at home. I don't know how many steel mill flashlights I had growing up in my house. God only knows. I'm surprised the mills were able to operate with all the flashlights that ended up going home with steel workers. I probably still have some in my house, and I never worked at a mill, but I'm sure my dad threw a couple in my garage at one time. So now that we have this initial finding aid that's open for research, we have some next phases here. We have 8 pallets in the back room of the library. Some of these contain models or parts of models. We have about 4 pallets of blueprints. We are looking for experts and opinions on model making. We do have somebody currently working with us on the blueprints. What do the artifacts not tell us, right? So what do we have? We don't really know what we have. Once we figure out what we have, we can then figure out what we don't have, which is also part of the story, right? We want to know what things we could look for to kind of solicit to donations. So when people come in to do research, they can hit up quite a few things. We're interested in the future of steel, pardon me, in the Calumet region. And we want Calumet region participation. So we want this to be sort of a public history type thing that goes on, that we're able to keep preserving. Sometimes when you talk about, oh, it's too late to interview my grandparents, well, it might be, it's too late to interview the ones that passed away, but it's not too late to interview the ones that are still alive. So the best next moment is now, hit those people up and learn their history. So what we're kind of looking for is where like libraries, archives, museum, and public history collide with this collection. People can come in and look at things, people can read about things, people can see the displays, and then people can create their own, do their own research and create their own public history by studying this collection. So the current projects, we have a few of them going on currently. Right now, Purdue University Northwest, we have an ongoing oral history project for steelworkers. The Steel Makers exhibit at the Museum of Science and Industry is currently there. I believe it's going to be around for 2 more years. The Calumet Curators are a group of people that work at historically significant areas throughout Northwest Indiana to not just preserve but interpret the history of the region. And then there's Voices from the Factory Floor, which is a little collaboration between myself and Emiliano Aguilar, and we're working on oral history and some displays and some writing and things like that. So we're kind of looking at the after effects of the steel mill there. So how does this fit into the country, right? It shows that the Calumet region's decline mirrors the US-wide deindustrialization trends. It's influenced by global automation and shifting labor markets. Some areas show modest recovery, but long-term effects remain visible. So things like those Superfund sites are going to be with us for God knows how long. So if we could study this industrial heritage, it helps inform future cultural, economic, and environmental decisions down the line. We always talk about how do you learn from history? Well, by repeating the good parts and not repeating the bad parts. So that's part of the big goal here is to not repeat the bad parts and to understand that all these decisions uh, affect real people. So, in conclusion, here, the Calumet region shows intertwined narratives of labor, industry, and the environment. Superfund sites reveal long term consequences of industrial pollution. What are the long term impacts of deindustrialization? We're kind of sitting in the midst of that right now. So, how's that going to affect us down the line? Oral histories preserve human stories behind cultural change. And this research is important, and this area is important to our country, not just people who lived here and grew up in the region, but it's a historically significant area that should be studied. And if we could study other areas that have recovered from sort of this deindustrialization, we'll be better off for it. One of the things that I did learn interviewing my dad is when they put in the continuous caster, a lot of people lost their jobs, but it worked better for the steel industry, and it's just part of industrialization. So not every change is for the bad; it's for the bad of the people down the line. But as we move forward, things like industries are going to change. People will be hurt down the line, but we hope to mitigate that a little bit. So let's see. I'm going to go ahead back to that's all that I have to share currently. So I'd be more than happy if anybody has any questions for me or for the collection. Pat, I'm glad Don Pedro's is still there. Little fun fact: they never carded, so we were able to go in and drink underage back in the day. So this was 30 some years ago now, but yeah, good stuff. So
Okay, any questions?
I don't have any questions specifically, but I do have a couple of comments and points of interest.
sure.
I'm Rod Sellers. I am the director of the Southeast Chicago Historical Museum. And although we concentrate on the Southeast side, we also do cross the border on
Yeah.
occasion. One thing, as I recall, Acme Coke closed somewhere around 2002.
Oh, okay.
A couple of years later, starting in 2004, I was part of a group that went onto the site many times, took a ton of pictures. I've got hundreds of pictures from visits to the site at that time. It had already begun to go into a state of disrepair.
Yeah.
Another comment in terms of the general steel industry in the Calumet region, we have been working for 10 years on a website. It's the Southeast Chicago Historical Project. The website URL is sechicagohistory.org. It's got a ton of information. We have done oral histories with steelworkers, in all the mills of the area, not just Acme.
Sure.
But there's a lot of resources on that page, which I think would help give context to the project you're working on.
Yeah.
And in terms of oral, we have transcripts, we have digitized some of the interviews we've done. So there's a lot of information that we have that we'd be more than happy to share.
Fantastic. And thank you, Rod, for bringing that up. When people do things like this in the past, it was very much the whole you're setting up your own little fiefdom to do your own research or your own historical society or that. But one of the things that I look at when I see a lot of the through these partnerships is really making them partnerships and really sharing information. And if there's collections that I have that you don't, or you have that I don't, and we can make sure that everybody knows where that information is, that's really the most important part of that, is that people will be able to find that material to do the research. So thank you for letting me know that. Actually, do you work with, is Linda, she retired from Hammond Public Library. Is she working with you?
No, we're pretty much the southeast side of Chicago.
Okay.
One of the problems we had when we were collecting all that material is we've got a tremendous space problem. We're limited in space. We couldn't store it anywhere, and that's why it ended up being stored at Pullman as long as it was.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we have a bit more space, so I'm looking forward to filling it up. Hopefully for the next 15 years, and then once I retire, it can be somebody else's problem after that. But
well, I did
Mr.
retire.
Coates? Oh, sorry.
I did retire, and it's still my problem.
yeah.
I was just going to jump in to say quickly that obviously Acme's on the southeast side, and Rod knows it probably better than anybody. And that operation took things to Pullman where it got stuck.
Yeah.
10 years while the fate of Pullman got sorted out. And then came a phase of like, where can it go? I was a former Chicago State professor. We looked at Chicago State. We thought it needed to be somewhere on the southeast side. Ultimately really grateful for Purdue being there, also for being with you as the archivist,
Yeah.
and also for being about 1.5 miles from Illinois. So it was close. And of course, a lot of workers worked at Acme, worked in Indiana, and vice versa across the state line. So it's highly accessible and kind of an end to not the end of the beginning of a long saga.
Yeah, my aunt's, I just found out when I interviewed my dad that my aunt's father had worked at Wisconsin Steel, and he was one of the guys that showed up and then just didn't have a job. It just closed like overnight. And that was just sort of, oh, well, and he lived there in Hammond, right over by the Purdue campus. So it was very much people moving back and forth between lines. Blake, I would love to be able to answer your question, but I don't know. I don't know what the economic impact or the economic landscape of the Calumet region was before Europeans came. Steel mills remaining from the 1800s, I couldn't tell you for sure, but I do think that there are definitely a few parts of some of those buildings out there that are from the early 1900s. I know there's a few little areas remaining throughout where, little shacks and things like that, but a lot of that's been replaced over time. And I do want to make full disclosure. I'm sitting here talking like I'm an actual historian. I am not a historian. I'm kind of an accidental historian. I'm an archivist that kind of got involved in this project. So usually we don't do this much historical research. So this is actually kind of a little unusual to be doing this much research firsthand on these collections. So yeah.
Mr. Coates? Oh,
Can I ask a question of Rod? What was the URL code you said to get the information?
sechicagohistory.org.
Thank you.
And there's a lot there's information on we've actually got 4 storylines in the website One is Mexican American Journeys, talks about the Mexican community in South Chicago. We've got one that is the closing of the mills, but it talks also about the mills growing up. One is the Memorial Day Massacre, and the fourth storyline is the environmental issues. So there's a lot of really good information.
Yes,
And when you use the term deindustrialization, Chris Wally, who wrote the book Exit Zero and did a documentary film, Exit Zero, that's been her academic life.
right.
In fact, last week we had a group, a class from MIT came into the museum, and unfortunately I was in Australia, but they were talking about the environmental aspects of the area. And Chris is teaching a class where engineers are being made aware of the environmental aspect of that business.
Wow, that's great. I last week was at the showing of the new movie that came out. So I'm trying to think the name of it. What?
Southeast Side by Stephen Walsh.
Right, by Stephen Walsh. Right. So this is all kind of comes together where I'm also was at Hegwish Library for talking about with the EPA about the Acme site and how it's it's moving quickly on the cleanup list, quicker than the Shroud properties, but it all kind of is tied together. My dad worked for LTV, and our family has a long history of having worked at the steel mills. So, yeah, so great. That's all good information. I will definitely check out the website.
Wonderful.
Mr.
Valerie?
Coates?
Oh, Valerie has her hand up, so we'll
Okay.
stop there first. Yes.
This is a very general question, Joseph, but I can relate to your saying that you became kind of an accidental historian.
Yes.
I could tell you a long story about how the same thing happened to me. I'm a retired history professor, but almost everything was stuff that I tumbled into, and it was so much fun, and I learned so much. And I think sometimes when you don't have a specialty in something, you come to it with kind of an open mind and can learn so much. One of the things that I've always enjoyed about investigating the past is the surprises. You'll be, researching something, going through the archives, and you think, well, all right, I basically know this. I understand the picture. And then something will jump out at you and astonish you. Could you describe a time or two when that's happened to you in your research?
Oh, so a little off topic, but it does deal with the Calumet region. One of our retired, and Valerie, I do remember you. One of my first academic library job was at Calumet College.
Oh my goodness.
I was the one that did the Bishop Grudka archive.
Got it.
Yeah, that was a while ago.
Yes, forgive me that I didn't
no.
make the connection. But
No, that's I got old, fat, and gray, so it's I don't look the same. The amount of I had no idea how much in Porter and Jasper and Newton County, how much of the Grand Calumet Marsh was sort of there. And I always thought that they really started monkeying with the environment probably in the 20s, 30s, 40s to build out the mills for like the war effort and that kind of thing. But they had drained half of those counties out through the Kankakee, and there were people that were squatting on the empty lake beds out there in the mid 1800s, and there was a giant tax scam where they somehow stole land from the state of Indiana and then raised money and then somehow paid tax money on property they didn't own back to the state. It was this whole big thing, and that was me and a retired English professor that were writing about the Grand Kankakee. But just the way that this whole area was built and how it was sort of formed and the things that we look at now. So, and I don't know how true this is, but I've heard it numerous times and I looked it up once that talked about the ball jars that were made from the sand along the lakefront from Michigan City around. They would load up the sand into train cars and send them down to Muncie to make ball jars out of the sand. And because the industry had died in the South, the glass industry, when the people moved from the South up to Muncie, they started to form the Klan again. And so the reason that the Klan emerged, part of the reason why the Klan reemerged in Indiana is because of the sand being on the lakefront that they shipped to Muncie, and the glass people from Kentucky and Tennessee moved up here to make glass. So there's these weird little things that are all kind of interconnected that you don't think about until you read it and it kind of clicks and you think, wow, that's strange. Who would have thought that? But
Mr. Coates?
yes.
Yeah. I grew up in Southeast Side and I was a student at St. Joe, East Chicago.
Oh yeah.
In May 1970, I'll never forget it because my regular job at General Mills in the summer hadn't opened yet. I had to wait 4 weeks. So I went to Interlake Steel, the one you talked about on Torrance. Yeah. So they gave me a shovel, they gave me a miner hat, and I was getting $2.67 an hour. And I had to walk down a ramp down a pit. I was under a major blast furnace, and my job was, there's a conveyor belt. It was reminding me of the old Flash Gordon movies, where I'm surrounded by coal that had spilled from the furnace. And my job was to shovel it quickly on the conveyor belt so it would leave the pit I was in. The only guy down there with his miner's hat, one little light, like a flashlight next to me. Well, I did this job for 4 weeks, and finally my other job opened up. And this day, to this day, I'll never forget having to take 2 baths after work. I still couldn't get the dirt off. And I was the only Caucasian there, the only white person there. But I met cool guys like Barbecue, who caught on fire once. That was his nickname. And who co-signed for everybody's loan. And anyway, after 4 weeks, I'm walking out, and everybody say, "Hey, sorry, kid, good luck in your other job and all that." And they said, by the way, did they ever tell you a couple guys died doing that job the last few years? One guy, the furnace blew up, and he's under the furnace. Yeah. And then the other guy, so much coal came in, which happened to me a couple times. It was like cartoonish. I was shoveling so quickly because it was coming up to my waist, just pouring. And I go, this is a heck of a way to have a summer job, So yeah. I'm just saying that's just the cultural thing of it was amazing for a kid, 20-year-old kid,
Yeah, my friend John Townsend is on the Hammond Fire Department. We went to high school together. We still see each other. And a matter of fact, both of his kids are graduating from Purdue Northwest this spring. So I'm actually I'm actually putting on the stupid robes and showing up to the commencement so I can see them. But he was talking about, my friend John was talking about how he was there at Station 8, and he said, oh yeah, my dad's friend, or my friend's dad, his parents still live down the street here in Hessville, was talking to him. He said, oh, his name's Charlie Coates. Do you know him? And he looked at him. He said, you mean Charlie Chu is your dad's, because my dad always had the big wad of the Levi Garrett, or he chewed that big leaf tobacco stuff. So he got the nickname Charlie Chu. So yeah, and this guy remembered his mill nickname from 20 years before or something. But yeah, it's just little things like that of an environment that you work in that people can kind of relate to. And I don't think we have those interpersonal relationships at work like we used to.
Yeah, you're probably right.
Yeah. Blake, Calumet Region, largest steel producer in the United States and not Pittsburgh. I think a lot of it had to do with easier access through the lake, through Lake Michigan, and then down through the shipping canal into the Mississippi. we were a little bit easier to get to than Pittsburgh and the mountains out there. So I don't know for sure, but I think it was the fantastic shipping we had. Plus, and I'm going to get on my soapbox here for a second because I have an audience. So I think Gary, Indiana is one of the places that should be making a giant comeback. And if we could get over a lot of the socioeconomic and racial issues that people have, you've got a canal, you've got a lake, you've got 8094, I-65, you have an airport that you can land an entire, a full-size 747 on, you've got a water treatment plant, you have people there, you have area that can be torn down and started over. I think if there were people with enough wherewithal and could figure out, I think Gary could be the city of the century for this century. I got a big plan. If I had Elon Musk money, it'd have been done already. But yeah, I really hope before I depart the region that I get to see Gary sort of be reborn. Hammond is still trucking along, but I think Gary has fantastic potential, and I wish it would do better than it was. So,
Hi, this is Mary Ann.
hello.
A few questions. First, what kind of hours does your archive have? When can I come?
That is a fantastic question. So we are open Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. till 5 p.m. when we're there. I do ask though, so much like today, I'm at our Westville campus because we have two campuses, and I'm also unfortunately now in management, so I have to do a lot of like managerial things that take me away from doing what I actually like to do. So I just ask that you come in, or before you come in, make sure I'm going to be here. So just send an email, let me know, and we try to do appointments.
Okay.
But once you're here,
Yeah. Do you need any kind of notice, and do I need to tell you what boxes I'm going to look at before I get there?
no, you're more than welcome to come whenever, make an appointment. If you give me an idea what you want, if you just want to start looking in boxes or looking at the displays, yeah, I welcome anybody who just wants to stop by and take a peek.
Mark has already warned me that what I want to see is probably not there.
Oh, okay.
I'm a volunteer steward at Eggers Grove, just north of Powers State Park.
Okay.
I have learned that a company named Cinders owned a piece of Eggers and refused to let go of it, and the Forest Preserve only acquired it with condemnation proceedings. Also, some of the railroads would not give up their land. But nobody knows anything about Cinders. I can find a paragraph or two in Forest Preserve annual proceedings, but nothing much about the company. And if you had a lot of records, maybe there was a reference to Cinders in there, and I could learn something more. Mark has warned me that nope, this was a pet coke, or a coke plant, and
Yeah.
it would not have been dumping slag, which is what Cinders actually did.
Yeah. So funny you said that. I saw Mark earlier on today at a meeting, and he was just talking about Cinders. So I'm going to do a little internet sleuthing tomorrow because it kind of piqued my interest.
Thank you.
And Rob might know too.
Yeah, we're glad you made. Little fun fact about slag. My grandfather saw slag as one of the great free resources. So when I was probably 10, 12 years old, he'd drive onto the plant and get an entire truckload. And that's what we would repave his driveway with. We'd just sort of shovel slag out onto the driveway, and he'd drive it over with the truck. And then that's all new gravel for the driveway. So,
Well,
yeah, I can't.
I just to say, I was thinking that because it was a coke plant, the slag would have come off the blast furnace, and I don't know where the records might be for that. And Rod, I can't remember if what was caught off of the blast furnace or where the other corporate records might be, but
there's
you're
got to be
muted,
something
Rod.
somewhere, because that giant pile of slag over by Wolf Lake didn't get there by itself. So maybe they had contractors doing that. It might have just been a shipping contractor too. So
I'm not familiar with cinders, but
No.
I'll do some research and see what I can find.
yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, and by the way, Rod, you should know that I have shared those beautiful diagrams of the amusement park that was supposed to go there on Wolf Lake with Mark. He Mark knows everything, but he didn't know about that. So I was glad to send him all that material you let me look at,
The
Rod.
more you know you don't know.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the Frank Lloyd Wright thing was incredible.
Isn't that something?
There's a on our Facebook page, which is Southeast Chicago Historical Society, in the files section at the beginning of the page, there's a PowerPoint on Wolf Lake history. And that is covered in that PowerPoint.
I do have one final question.
Yes.
In another life, I was a librarian.
Okay.
And when I was taking cataloging courses, they talked about cataloging ephemera.
Mm-hmm.
So cataloging things like the gloves that Horowitz wore before he started a performance, or, tickets and stuff.
Sure.
So what do you think? What surprised you? What kind of weird item have you got in your collection, or multiple weird items?
Oh, so in Hammond, so because we started out as a university archive and then we moved to getting the Acme stuff, there really isn't all that much that's odd. It's pretty pedestrian, but I will tell you, I've worked in two other archives. I worked at the Calumet Regional Archives with Steve McShane back in the day. And then I worked at Calumet College. And when I worked at Calumet College, we had received the Bishop Grutka collection. So full disclosure, I did not grow up Catholic. I grew up Presbyterian. So we get all this ephemera from the bishop. So a lot of the things that you find seem pretty standard. There was a lot of paperwork. There were VHS tapes and cassettes. Some of the old wire recordings from like the 50s that we really couldn't read. And then there were things like that he would use in his own home for like mass. So none of this stuff really surprised me, because I thought to myself, well, of course, a priest, then a bishop is going to have stuff to do mass. Like that's sort of their gig, A lot of communion stuff, all that. A lot of vestments. None of the vestments surprised me. It was the shoes. So I ended up with green shoes, purple shoes, white shoes, and something else, because they would change the color of the shoes with the season of, so they would wear whatever color during Lent and whatever color during ordinary time and whatever color during this. And I just thought, man, this had to have been a really expensive hobby or a really expensive job for all these vestments and things. I will also admit I did try on the miter just to get a scale to see, because people were like, how big was he? And I'm like, I don't know. And at the time I'm like, well, I'm like 6 foot, 200 pounds. Let me see what happened. The man had a pretty large head. He wore at least a 7.5-inch hat. He was a bigger guy, because mine's 7 3/8. So it was a little bit, but the other thing that I really enjoyed when I worked at the Calumet Regional Archive was the collection of stuff that was left over from ANCO. So he had old salesman boxes that were full of things like windshield wiper blades and radiator caps and little accessories for cars and things like that from back in the day. So those are probably the two things that I can think of and go, those are really neat things there. So
Thank you.
oh, my pleasure.
I'm not sure if you have this, but the one piece that I often think of in the Acme collection that we rescued was a life-size calendar with a picture of Pam Grier on it.
I have not found Mark. Mark warned me about Pam Grier. Every time I see Mark, Pam Grier comes up. I have not found that yet, so I'm not sure what happened to it. Unfortunately, it's quite the shame. I have a picture of the painting of Pam Grier, so I don't
Someone's got
know.
it.
Somebody somewhere has it over their living room, over their couch in their living room, much to their probably wife's dismay.
Not
Although
me.
I was told if I find it, Mark, it goes to Mark. He's
Yeah.
claimed
No,
it already.
I think it should go to Rod. Yeah.
Somebody could have the Pam Grier if we find it. For those of you who don't know what we're talking about, it looks like a giant oil painting. That's a line. It's Pam Grier, full afro. I believe I want to imagine bikini, but I don't think so.
Too many.
As soon as this is over, I'm going to start looking through the pictures and see if I have a picture of it.
Okay. But yeah, that would be an interesting artifact to have. I'm not sure what I would do with it at Purdue, but I'll keep some of you guys in mind. If I ever come across it, you guys will be the first ones to find out.
I gotta go. Thank you, Joe. Thanks, Mike, and it's
Thank
nice
you,
to see
Mark.
everybody.
Is I see you again?
Thanks, Mark. Any more questions? Yes, this is getting pretty entertaining. I thought maybe we could go on a little bit more, but some of us are maybe a little bit tired. I don't know, but this is very interesting, and I enjoyed the presentation terribly.
Oh, well,
So,
thank you.
yeah, good. And so, thanks for everyone else for coming, and we'll return next month, the first Tuesday in May, and we'll see you then. Thanks for coming.
Great.
Take
Thank
care.
you. Thank you for having me, everyone.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.